Hello, everybody. These are your two sharp needles, Jack Stanley and Gavin Rice. And today, we are going to be talking about the very beginnings of the Victor Talking Machine Company and other companies. And we're going to have some really rare things to show you that Jack has examples of, which I'm really excited for you all to see.
So how you doing there? Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
So, may as well get right to work here. There's so much to talk about, and of course, the Victor Talking Machine Company uh, is, as we talked in the last episode, a creation of pure necessity, because Berliner was basically, for all intents and purposes, in the United States, uh, basically put out of business by the forces of Colombia and that magnificent lawyer that everyone should have hired, Philip Morrow. And of course, the person that really got things started with the disc, of course, is Berliner. And we really haven't totally gone through Berliner yet, but we will. But the thing about Berliner is Berliner sets the stage for John. Okay, the whole idea of the disc record. Because you've got to remember that the disc machine that Berliner used initially, because he wanted to keep prices down, kind of looked like a glorified egg beater. I mean, it was, you had to sit there and try to turn this and keep the record going at the same speed. It didn't work too well. And you had to sit there and hold it down. And I've done those before. And it's certainly, you're not going to play a bunch of records in the evening. You'll be exhausted. It was aerobic entertainment in its finest form. And the thing is that Johnson, of course, develops a spring motor. And then, of course, everything takes off. He has the factory and everything else. Now, what Berliner starts doing is he starts advertising and he starts sending people here, there, and everywhere. And names start appearing that will be very important as time goes on in the industry. In Philadelphia, they open up a Berliner gramophone store. And who's running it? Alfred Clark. And who is Alfred Clark? He's going to be very important when we get to the gramophone in Europe, the Bell and Tinter, and later the Gramophone Company. And then, of course, there's recording studios, not just in Washington, D.C., where Berliner had been doing most of his work, but he sends two individuals to open up recording studios. One in Philadelphia, which is Fred Gaisberg. He opens up a studio in 1897. And at the same time in New York, Calvin Child opens up a recording studio. And that's very, very important because Calvin Child is going to be a major force in Victor. I alluded to him before. I was sitting there going, I know his name, but I couldn't think of it. Calvin Child. Okay. He is basically, when it comes to music, the right-hand man to Eldridge Johnson. In fact, Eldridge Johnson and Child were picking music for Berliner in the earlier days. They were doing that kind of stuff. And Child, of course, has a great deal of contacts in the classical music world. And he also is friendly with a lot of classical musicians. And we'll talk about other people like this at the Gramophone and Typewriter Company as well later. Now, the thing is that everything runs fine until 1898. And then, of course, Gaisberg is sent over to Europe to become the recording engineer for the Gramophone Company. It's not the Gramophone and Typewriter Company yet.
That's right.
They haven't made that stupid mistake yet. But that's another story altogether. But Calvin Child stays in New York, starts recording a number of people, and perhaps one of the most important people he touches base with is Emilio de Gagorza. Now, he is a baritone of Spanish heritage from Brooklyn, New York. And the interesting thing is he has all these various nom de plumes, and he becomes 5 different singers for the Berliner, Zonophone, and Victor Company. And it isn't until about 1904 that he actually starts to make records under his own name. And of course, he becomes a Red Seal artist because he's an amazingly gifted individual. Now, Johnson, right from the beginning, is saying, you know something, I see what they're doing in Europe. They're getting a lot of attention recording high-profile artists, operatic performers, operatic singers. Now, in the United States, as I said before, the big sellers were, minstrel shows, coon songs, little ditties, trumpet solos, Another thing was flutes and piccolos. They were really popular because they recorded well. Very simple, the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, that kind of stuff. So, just to give you an idea here, this is early opera on a very early Eldridge Johnson. And of course, we have 2 singers. We have Madame Chalia, who is from Cuba. Quite an amazing soprano. But who's singing with her? Senor Francisco. Who the hell is he? He's Emilio de Gagorza. In fact, he's going to be Mr. Franklin. He's going to be Mr. this, Mr. that, Mr. You name it. You're going to find all these different names, and nom de plumes are all Emilio de Gagorza. He's half of a record album by himself, That's the interesting thing. So, once the Victor Company was founded, and we went through some of the problems in the last episode where we talked about court battles and whatever. You can't use the word gramophone. That becomes a purely European term. And it's not used in the United States at all. It dies with the court case with Eldridge Johnson. But once he joins forces with Berliner and forms the Victor Talking Machine Company of Camden, New Jersey, on October the 3rd, 1901. I've always been very happy about that date because that's my birthday, the 3rd. I wasn't born that year, but I was, but a few years later. But nonetheless, on October the 3rd, 1901, the Victor Talking Machine Company is founded. And at this point, Johnson says, it's time to get started. Our last episode, we talk about the climax record. Johnson is going to give Columbia a big black eye with that. That's another show. We'll make that a cliffhanger for a little later. But also the other thing is that he sits there and talks to the child and said, we've got to do something here. We've got to start elevating our recordings to be something more than just what everybody else does. And so he sends his friend, his advance man, one might say, and his name is Belford Royal. And Belford Royal is always looking after Eldridge Johnson's interest. And he becomes a major assistant to the Gramophone Company and William Barry Owens and all that gang out there. And also Johnson is preparing machines, creating various equipment for the Gramophone Company, which is just getting ready to get involved in a silly scheme because William Barry Owens, brilliant guy, he's the guy that comes up with Nipper. He's the guy who has all these wild ideas. He's an excitable, instantaneous idea guy. Sometimes that's not a good idea sometimes. And he decides to invest a great deal of the assets of the company into a typewriter, which was an absolute disaster, but they become known as the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. We'll get into more on that later. So Royal is there, and Royal is smoothing out the waters at Bell and Tainter for Johnson to send Calvin Child over. As we know, Calvin Child travels on the Oceanic, the queen of the ocean. Fancy, fancy ship. It was first class, of course. And sails over. And then he spends several months in England going over various recordings and getting copies and getting stampers and getting all the stuff done, including some recordings by this young new tenor named Enrico Caruso. Now, nobody really had heard of Caruso in the United States. He was in his 20s. He was a very young guy. And he had made his first records for the Gramophone and Typewriter Company in 1902. So he was just at the beginnings of his career. But he went there and he wanted to get some of the great names, the great artists. And this was a secret, but not exactly a very well-kept one. Because in the United States, the Columbia Phonograph Company, otherwise known as the Columbia Graphophone Company, heard tell that the Victor Company was going to get all these stampers of all these famous European, Russian, French, but various artists from all over the world. And they're going to have this absolute catalog of incredible singers. So Edward Easton, who was very much in a way like Owens at the GNT, quick to jump to ideas. Sometimes they're not the most plausible. And so he says, we have the Metropolitan Opera House here in New York City. Let's go to the singers from the Metropolitan Opera and pay them whatever they want. Give them great deals of money to make records. On the double. We have to do this quick. Chop, chop. Okay. So they go to Marcella Sembrick, perhaps one of the greatest sopranos of all time at the Met. And she agrees, but I believe the amount is somewhere around $3,000 to make just a couple of records. Antonio Scotti, the Italian baritone, Ernestine Schumann-Heink, and Edward Deresque, one of the Deresque brothers. He agrees to make 3 records for quite a bit of money as well. And so Columbia is tossing out massive amounts of money, monies that would equal to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. And so Calvin Child is doing all of his work, getting everything together. He hops on board the Oceanic, comes back with 50 stamps. And they're ready, to start going. And they want to have everything ready for March of 1903. Late March. In early 1903, Columbia comes out with their operatic recordings. Now, here's the interesting thing. Let's take a look at a few of these, just for fun. Stand by. This is the first issue of the Columbia Red Steel. And this was their Grand Opera series.
Rare stuff right here.
This is Campaneri, the baritone, very famous baritone, singing Serenade. But it's kind of like rushed a little bit, because you'll notice it says Columbia Disc Record. And it doesn't say anything about being operatic outside of the color of its label.
Right. And it's interesting that red was associated with opera, back then. You know, I wonder why. Maybe the curtains,
Well, it all started in Russia.
right? As you were saying.
Interesting, Russia went red. I don't know, you know, but Russia started the Red Seal, and GNP said that's a good idea,
Yeah,
and they
it's
called them
very interesting.
Celebrity Records. They were called Celebrity Records. Fine. So, pardon my back. Victor finally, 2 weeks later, comes out with their, and this is the first Red Seal ever made. This is number 5,000.
Wow.
And 5,000, it was called the 5,000 series. And these things were $2.50 each. That's insanely expensive and falls into that category of which we talked about before, snob appeal. Now, the thing is, they were an unglorious failure because not many people bought them because they're so expensive. Of course, the thing was that Victor was none too pleased that Columbia was using red for their special. And so they kind of mentioned to Columbia, hello, it's not a very good idea for you to use red, and we have lots of patents, and you should use a different color because the G&T records that we're using are red labels, our labels with red, you use a different color. And remarkably, Columbia agreed. They switched their label to black. And you'll also notice it says on top, Grand Opera District. Now these were $2, which was still remarkably expensive. You have to think about this. Think how much $2 was, in 1903. I mean, it's a remarkable amount of money. I mean, the average person was making maybe, if they're lucky, $5 a week.
Mm-hmm.
This was half of the salary.
Yeah, that's right.
Insane. So the thing is that the battle is begun. And the whole idea behind this, as I mentioned before, is that Eldridge Johnson wanted the Victor machine and the Victor record to be looked at like the Steinway of piano.
Yep.
He wanted the whole thing to be a class unto itself. And creating that whole sense of snob appeal, high art, and having the greatest singers on earth, the greatest performers, the greatest instrumentalists, all of the people will be on the Victor.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, with all the help over there with Calvin Child, goes back and forth because they add to this list. And they have couriers taking the Oceanic back with more of the records. Just remember this. Anybody that has those 5,000 records or the 91,000, which is made from the 5,000, or the 61,000, the early ones, are made from the 5,000. They all were transferred on the Oceanic. Kind of neat to think we know how they got to where they were. You usually don't know the method of transportation. Now, the interesting thing is that Calvin Child, in 1907, is in Europe again, picking more music, because it was really beneficial for Victor. It was magnificently beneficial for Victor to do this deal of transferring them, because it wouldn't be until well into like 1905 that Victor really could start holding its own with its domestic recordings. And eventually, of course, Victor would run just about everything and also own a good part of the gramophone company as well. But in 1907, Calvin Child is in Europe. And where does he go and how does he get back to the United States? He takes the maiden voyage of the Lusitania, the greatest ship in the world. Of course, there are stampers brought too.
Yeah, that's right.
And Lusitania takes many stampers to basically New York, and then he's on his way to Camden.
Yep.
So the neat thing about Calvin Child is this. He was the director of the recording department for Victor. He was the guy who would work and make the contracts with all the singers. He would work on all the deals. Everything was through Calvin Child. And the other thing that people don't realize, they often heard Calvin Child's voice because he would make the announcements on the Victor records that were being made. Many times when you listen to a Victor record, you hear the same voice introducing everything. That's Calvin Child. He was involved in every aspect of recording for the Victor Talking Machine Company. He's such an important part of the cog of the wheel for that company. And in many respects, never talked about because people don't really know about him. But there's a number of people which we're going to go through and introduce you to, and these are important folks that would have a profound effect on the recording industry and the Victor Talking Machine Company. And that's my recitative to our conversation here, since we're talking about opera. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the 5000 series only lasts for 6 months. And then it is dropped and the numbers change. At Columbia, it's a very different story. After spending an absolute fortune to get all of these recording artists and not having the most fantastic recording studios, and every one of those records has an opening announcement with the opera and the singer, Columbia record. I mean, it started sounding somewhat antiquated. It wasn't very modern sound. And they didn't sell that well. So Edward Easton, being Edward Easton, canceled the project. And they dropped it. And then they would bring it back every now and then to see if it did better. And it wouldn't. And then they would drop it again. It was a terribly devastating blow to the Columbia Company. I mean, they had the opportunity to really defeat Victor.
Oh, yeah.
Because they were ahead of Victor. But see, the whole thing was that they did not see outside of the ballpark. They just looked right at the field, as it were, and said, this is not doing well right now. Johnson was saying, in 10 years, this will be fantastic to have. We will have a reputation. That was the greatest mistake that Edward Easton would make in those early days. There were other mistakes he made, but that was a doozy and cost the company a real fortune. That's quite a bit of information we tossed out here.
Yes, and we are just surpassing the 20-minute mark. And now this was probably one of the more interesting episodes that I think we've done in it, which is really great. I'm glad that you got that really rare stuff. That was unbelievable that you pulled out those records. I've never seen a red seal Columbia like that before. So that was really great, Jack. Thank you.
Sure. We'll put out some other stuff too. It's going to be interesting to show some of the really early stuff, which is an area, a lot of collectors, a lot of people involved in collecting recordings, very rarely touch the very early stuff. Also, it's hard to find too.
That's right. That's right.
You know, and the thing is that that early period of time is just full. It's there. It's sort of like this. If you put it this way, they're shooting something in the air and see if it sticks. That's more or less what's happening. They're doing it in various different ways. Let's try to do opera and see what happens. It does have an effect, because one of the most fascinating things that happens with those records that were put out by Victor, Enrico Caruso is hired at the Metropolitan Opera House, not by a physical audition, but by the manager listening to his record. Think about that. Let that sink in for a second. That's something that had never happened. And that was showing right away, right from the beginning, that Caruso, who would become one of the standard bearers for the Victor Talking Machine Company, you could not have an advertisement for Victor without Caruso somewhere. Okay, he was a major force. But just think about that. They listened to his record and said, he's good.
Right.
I mean, that's really incredible.
Yeah. You're right.
You know,
Absolutely.
today we'll send in a recording, you know, as an audition, and people, oh, that's right. But in 1903, no. That was about as foreign as the South Pole. Okay, that was just totally foreign, but it happened. And that was the start of Victor becoming the preeminent company. And of course, they were not missing the boat as soon as Caruso comes to the United States. He doesn't record for Columbia. Victor grabs him and sets up contracts. And the interesting thing, I think, to close with Caruso, I sat and talked to his son on the phone many, many years ago, back in the 1980s. And he was talking about his father, and it was really quite interesting. And, you know, he said, you know, my father, you know, he could just go to the recording studio and everybody would just like kind of treat him like royalty. And he said, I went with him one time and I was a gangling teenager, and, you know, the violinists all tapped their bows, as they said. And he said, when he sang into the horn, when he finished the record, into the recording horn. So I always thought that was kind of a neat thing to think of, but he was such an important part. And of course, his love of singing and his love of performance, and the money that Victor gave him, and he made fortune, you know, through royalties. That was the deal worked out. He's one of the first singers to get royalties. Of course, other singers saw what he did and said, that's a good idea. And